Welcome back to the Bootcamp series. This is going to be maybe a long video, but I think it should be a fun video. So before I talk at all, I want to show you a sneak peek. I want to show you a sneak peek preview of the finished product that we're going to build together. So you open the app and it says choose a dog breed, and then when you select one, it shows you a slideshow. The images sort of animate or fade or transition in between each other, and then you're free to choose a different dog breed, and obviously you get a new slideshow. Now what makes this interesting is that none of these dog breeds and none of these images are actually spelled out or hard-coded in our HTML or JavaScript. Instead, we're fetching all of that data programmatically from another server out on the web, and this is all thanks to the JavaScript code that we're going to write. Now hopefully you did a little bit of homework and checked out the 10 days of JavaScript, because if you didn't, there's going to be parts of this video that maybe feel like we're moving too fast or we're not explaining every concept. If we stopped to explain every concept, this video would be 2 or 3 hours long, and I don't think that would be enjoyable for anyone. There are already a ton of different videos on the web explaining the very basics of JavaScript. And then there are also a ton of videos that show you super advanced things, but I don't think there are enough videos that are sort of the Goldilocks level of difficulty. What I mean is relatively basic, but complex enough that you're still actually building something that's exciting. Anyways, that's enough with this introduction. I'm excited to build this slideshow with you, so let's jump into the action. Okay, so in VS Code, I'm working with a new empty folder. I've created just one brand new empty file, index.html. Inside it, I'll say doc and then hit tab. Inside the body area, let's just say hello world for a bit of placeholder text. And because our focus in this video is JavaScript, let's begin by attaching a JavaScript file down here right before the closing body tag. So we just say script, hit tab. On the opening script tag, we just say src or source equals quotes, and then we just point towards a file. You could name it anything, but I'll name it main, and then we want it to end with .js. So this will point towards that file. Let's go ahead and save this. Now we need to go actually create that file. So in my folder, new file, I'll name it exactly main.js. Okay, now just for a quick test to make sure that our JavaScript file is actually being loaded, we can say console.log, parentheses to call that, give it a string, so just quotes, and say hello from our JS. Let's give that a save, and now let's go view our HTML file in the browser. So if I refresh, cool, there we see hello world, and we can check out the JavaScript by right-clicking and choosing inspect. That will open up your dev tools, and then instead of elements, if we click on console, cool, there we see hello from our JavaScript. So now that we're up and running, right, we have a basic web page and we've attached a bit of JavaScript, what do we actually want to do first with our JavaScript code? Well, if we look at the finished product example, I think the first thing we should do is create this select or drop-down element that you can click on, and then it shows you all of the different breeds of dogs. Now, what makes this interesting, and sort of the entire point of this dog app, is that I didn't hard code this list of breeds. What I mean is, if I view the source for this HTML, that select drop-down element with all of the breeds, it lives in this div that has an ID of breed. So that actual list of breeds doesn't live in our HTML, and I can click here to look at the finished product JavaScript. Nowhere in this code will you see a giant list of dog breeds either. So the question is, where is all of this data of these breeds coming from? Well, it's being pulled dynamically from another server out on the internet somewhere. So right now, let me talk a little bit about how I found this magical server with dog information. So there's this really popular page on GitHub called Public APIs. Don't worry, I know we don't know what an API is yet. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But this page lists all sorts of different APIs which give information about different things. So there's ones for animals, right? And you can see this list just goes on and on. Finance, health, music. But if you click on animals, there's this one called dogs, and I just clicked on that. Okay, and that takes me to this website, the Dog API. Now, before I show you how we can use this website and use its data in order to build our product for this video, I first want to talk a little bit about what an API is, because that's a phrase I've been throwing around, and in this bootcamp series, we've never heard of that yet. Well, if you jump over to Wikipedia, you can see that API is just an acronym that stands for Application Programming Interface. And you could read all about this if you want to, but in short, I would say that an API is just an organized way for one application to communicate with another totally separate and different application. So, for example, this application that has all sorts of information about dogs, well, they've created an application programming interface for their app, and now we can communicate or work with their data from within our application, right? We can programmatically request data from the dog app or from the dog API. Let me show you how this works. So from this dog API website, from their homepage, they have this URL here. And if you copy and paste this URL and open it in a new tab, you can see it gives me a bit of raw code, and it says message : and then here's a value. And this is just a URL for a dog image. You can see it ends in .jpg. And every time I refresh, it gives me a new random dog URL. This is because if we look at the address bar, this specific URL is designed to give you one random photo. Okay, but back on the actual dog API website, if I click on documentation in their sidebar, you can see it's going to give me different endpoints. An endpoint is just the URL. So here we see if we want a list with all of the dog breeds, this is the exact URL we can use. So if I copy and paste this URL into a new tab, it gives me a bunch of raw data, but there you can see there's all of the different dog breeds. Okay, so we can use these values to populate our select dropdown element. And then not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but once we have the breed that we're interested in, here you can see from their dog app API documentation, there's a by breed endpoint. So if I click on that, if you want to get all of the images for a specific dog breed, this is an example of the URL you can use, right? So it's their address /API/breed, and then this is the part that you would hollow out and make dynamic. So instead of hard coding it to hound, you can just put in any dog breed here, right? And then /images, and if you viewed this in a new tab, that's going to give you all of the URLs for all of the images for the hound breed. So I think you can sort of see that with a bit of programming, we can use the dog API data to build out our dog slideshow. So at this point, the first question becomes, how in the world can we programmatically consume that data? Or how can we use our JavaScript to go out onto the internet, right? And this is the first one that we would want to fetch, right? It's just the URL that lists all dog breeds. How can we fetch or retrieve this data with our JavaScript? Well, let me show you. So first, we would want to copy the address or URL into our clipboard. Okay, and then remember, we just have this empty web page with hello world. So back in VS Code, within our main.js file, we can get rid of this console log hello from our JavaScript. So we have a clean slate, and let's say fetch, parentheses to call it. This is a function that the web browser offers to us. So we didn't have to create this function, we're just calling it. The idea is inside these parentheses, we give it an argument, so quotes, we give it a string of text or URL. So I'm just going to paste in my clipboard. So we're just saying we want to fetch whatever data lives at this URL. So this code looks simple enough, but there's actually a bit of complexity going on because fetch is not just going to return the data that lives at this URL. Instead, the fetch function is going to return a promise. So the question becomes, what in the world is a promise? Well, before we even get into promises, let me show you something really quick. So down here, if we say 2 + 2, and then on a new line, 10 + 10, 100 divided by 10. Now, most of the time in JavaScript, when it sees a line of code, it's going to finish and complete that operation before it moves on to the next one. right? So any computer made in the last 50 years is only going to take like less than a millisecond to calculate 2 plus 2. But it's going to finish that before it moves on to 10 plus 10. And it's going to finish that before it moves on to this line, so on and so forth. Now, this behavior of completing one action before moving on to the next action, this makes sense when each action is only going to take a millisecond or less. However, when it comes to fetching data out on the web, well, that could take a long time. We don't know how slow or fast someone's network connection is. We don't know how long it's going to take for this server to actually respond. And so this could take a while. And we don't want to block the execution of all of our other code on the page while this finishes. So back to the question of, well, if fetch returns a promise, what in the world is a promise? Well, it's a way of letting this operation run in the background. And we don't care how long it takes. It could take a second or 5 seconds, but it's not going to block any of our other code from running. So JavaScript could begin this task, and then it's going to let all of these other tasks finish, and then maybe 5 seconds in the future, when this actually completes, then we can do something with it. Now, there are several different ways to work with a promise, but let me show you what we can do. So let me get rid of this example code. So we just have our fetch line. And actually, for the next minute or two, I don't want you to type this out with me and follow along, because first, I'm going to show you the way that promises have always or traditionally worked. But we'll see that the syntax is a bit messy and hard to read or make sense of. So then after that, I'll show you the more modern way, and that's when I'll want you to follow along with me. But I don't want to just jump right into the modern way, because I do want you to see how promises work in their simplest or traditional form first. Okay, so again, you don't need to type this out for the next minute or two, but fetch is going to return a promise. So at the end of this line, we're working with a promise. So we can say dot then to call a method. So a promise has a method named then. And in these parentheses, we can give it a function as an argument, and it will wait to actually call or execute this function until this has completed. We as the programmer have no idea how long this will take. It could be 20 milliseconds or it could be 10 seconds. Okay, we just know that then we'll call it at the appropriate time. And what's cool is this isn't going to block any of our other lines of code below it. So we just list this out. JavaScript will continue running all of our other code down here. And then once this actually completes, the function here can run. So in these parentheses, I'll include an anonymous function. So function parentheses, curly brackets. Again, you don't need to type this out. When this function gets called by then, it's going to pass this as the response into the function. So for a parameter, I'll say response. Now inside the body of this function, I will return response.json. So this represents the dog API server's response. And then we're calling a method of JSON, meaning we just want to deal with the actual data that it sent. Now, for the longest time, this confused me because I thought that this would actually return that data. However, this actually returns another promise itself. So this initial promise will complete as soon as we hear back from the server at all. And we just have basic things like the headers. But then this is another promise, and it will actually complete when we have the body or the data of the request. And we've parsed it as JSON. So now, if this function is just returning another promise, right? This returns a promise. We can just chain on at the very end here another then, and that will only run once this is actually completed. Okay, so then inside these parentheses, we can say function, parentheses, curly brackets. When then calls our function, it's going to pass in the data. So I'll say data for parameter. And then inside the body of this function, I can say console.log data. Now, I am fully aware that none of this made any sense. I'm sort of making fun of the old school promise syntax, right? This code is ugly. It's difficult to read. It doesn't make intuitive sense. And having to chain along multiple thens like this just doesn't look elegant. However, if I save this and refresh in the browser and check my console, this is what the dog API server is sending back. If we expand it, there's a property called message, and inside message, there is the list of all of the different dog breeds. Personal favorite of mine is Corgi. Anyways, so this was the ugly or traditional syntax of working with promises. There's nothing wrong with using this approach, For a long time, this is really all we had as web developers. However, now that we have a general idea of how a promise works, right? Just this general idea of they take an unknown amount of time, and then once it actually completes, we want to do something. Just with that in mind, now let's look at the modern approach of working with a promise. I'm actually going to delete everything on the screen right now, so I am going to copy the dog URL into my clipboard because I do want that. Let me delete everything. Okay. Now, in order to use the modern or easier syntax of working with promises, we do need to be inside of an asynchronous function. So in our first lesson with JavaScript, we learned how to make a function, right? You just say function and then you give it a name. We could name it anything, but let's name our function start. So function start, parentheses, curly brackets. So this is a regular or traditional function. And to turn it into an asynchronous function, you just write async as a separate word right before function. So now that this is an async function, inside it, we can use the modern way of working with promises. Now, I'm well aware that the promise code I wrote just a moment or two ago didn't make any sense. I do want this code to make sense. So type this out with me. If you need to pause the video to type out async function like this, that's great. But inside the function, here's what we're going to do. Let's say const response, right? The response from the dog server equals, and this is the new part. We say await and then fetch. We call fetch inside the parentheses. We give it that dog server URL, the endpoint. Now the key here is await. This is super interesting. So now below this, if we say 2 plus 2, 4 plus 4, 10 plus 10, even though fetch returns a promise, because we included the word await here, this is super important. Await is going to make it so JavaScript will not run these lines of code until this actually completes, until the promise returns or resolves. We can get rid of these math lines. So now this is pretty cool. Now on a new line, still within this function, we can say const data equals, and again, we can use await and just say response.json. Okay, and then below that on a new line, we can just log that data to the console. Console.log data. Ultimately, we don't really want to just log the data to the console. Eventually, we will want to use the data to build out this HTML select dropdown. But for now, let's just log it to the console. Now, in just a moment, we can circle back and I'll explain what this code is really doing. But for now, this is just a function definition. So in order to actually have this code run or execute, we need to call our function. So right below it, let's just say start parentheses to call our function. So if we save this and reload in the browser and check your console, you should now indeed see this, right? This is the dog server's response, and inside it there's a message property with all of the breeds. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. So fetch is going to resolve its promise as soon as we hear back from the server at all. So as soon as we just have really basic header information from the server, this will resolve. Okay, then we're taking that response and we just want the JSON data. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So this is where we want the actual body or the meat and potatoes of the response from the server. And we want to parse it into a readable format, right? And we're storing that in a constant variable called data. And then, since we awaited that, right, we're awaiting until that is actually finished. Well, now we can do anything we want with that data. And we don't actually want to log it to the console. We actually want to build that HTML select dropdown. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's get rid of this console log line. And we could write out the code to transform the data into an HTML select right here. However, I like to stay organized. I want each function to sort of be bite-sized or have just one single responsibility. So let's say the responsibility of this function is just to get or fetch the data. And then let's have the code that creates the HTML select, let's have that in a different function. So maybe down here, the very bottom of our code, let's create a new function. And you could name it anything, but I'll name it create breed list, parentheses, curly brackets. And then in this function, where we were logging it to the console, let's just call this function and pass it our data. So create breed list, parentheses to call it, and give it an argument of data. And actually, let's say data.message. Because if you look in the console, in the browser, remember the server is giving us back this bit of JavaScript code with two properties, message and status. Status just says success, but the message property is really what contains the list of dog breeds. So really that's all we're interested in passing on to our other function. So data.message. Now in this function, let's receive this with a parameter. So in these parentheses, you could name your parameter anything. You could call it X or pizza or unicorn. Why don't we call it breed list? Okay, now it's up to this function, or I should say this function has one single responsibility of just taking that data and creating this sort of HTML select dropdown. So with that in mind, let's dig into our HTML, because right now our page just looks like this, and let's give ourselves a bit of HTML that we can hook onto with JavaScript. So back in our HTML, first of all, let's change the hello world to be a heading level 1 that says infinite dog app. And then right below that, let's create a div, so div, and then to give it an ID with the tab trigger system, you can say div hashtag, and then the name of the ID. And then if you hit tab, that gets converted into a div with that ID. Okay, now inside this div, let's create that drop down or select element. So it's just select, hit tab. We actually don't need the name or ID on this opening tag. And then inside the select, you just include multiple options. So option, hit tab. We actually don't need a value. If you wanted the value to be something different than what you visually see, that's what this is for. So for example, if you wanted someone to visually see 3, but you wanted the actual value to be the digit 3, you could do that. We don't actually need the value though, so let's just remove that. And for example, for the first one, we can say choose a dog breed. Okay, then below that, just for an example, let's hard code a few dog breeds. So option, let me get rid of that value. Let's say Corgi. Copy and paste that a few times. Let's have Boxer and Bulldog. Let's go ahead and save that. And then if we refresh in the browser, cool, infinite dog app, choose a dog breed, you get the idea. Now we don't actually want this to live in our HTML though. We want our JavaScript to be able to create this. So let's do this. We want to keep our div with an ID of breed, but I want you to copy this entire select. So just like this, let's cut this entire thing into our clipboard because we want to be able to use it in our JavaScript. So let's save this with just the empty breed div now. Then back in our JavaScript, inside our create breed list function, let's say document dot get element by ID, and that's a method. Give it an argument of quotes. We gave that div an ID of breed. This will return an object that represents that empty div. And then let's look inside it and set its inner HTML property to equal. And now we could just say a string of text. So simple quotes and then hey. And then if we save that and refresh, we do see hey right there. However, what if instead of just a simple bit of text, we want to be able to have something that can drop down to multiple lines? Well, in JavaScript, a regular string of text or a quote cannot drop down to a new line. However, if we get rid of that and say equals and then 2 backticks, this is the character to the left of the 1 key or right above your tab key. If we want 2 of them, and now in between them, we can drop down. So maybe in between them right about here, I'll just paste in my clipboard. Right, so now we have that select element. Let's save that, refresh. Cool, so now we have this element, only now all we need to do, we don't want these options here to be hard-coded. We want to dynamically or programmatically loop through the breed list that we retrieved and display all of them here. So let's actually keep this first one that says choose a dog breed, but then let's get rid of these 3 hard-coded Corgi, Boxer, Bulldog. And instead, within a template literal, which is what we're in because of the 2 backticks, right? So instead of just a traditional string of text, we're in a template literal. In here, we can say $ curly brackets. And now inside these curly brackets, we can do something dynamic. Now, if you watched my 10 days of JavaScript playlist here on YouTube, you'll know that it's fairly easy to loop through an array using something called map. However, this list of breeds that the dog server gives back to us, it's actually not an array. It's an object with a bunch of properties, but luckily for us, JavaScript has a great way of returning an array based on an object's property names. Let me show you what I mean. So in this $ curly brackets, let's say uppercase O object. This is JavaScript's big picture blueprint or sort of cookie cutter mold for all objects. And we can look inside it, so dot, for a method called keys. Now inside these parentheses, we give it an object, and then altogether this is going to return an array. If you don't know what an array is, that's okay, but I do strongly encourage you to pause this video and in a new tab, maybe go watch day number 4 of my 10 days of JavaScript. Anyways, in these parentheses, let's say breed list. So this will return an array, and in JavaScript, all arrays have access to a method named map. So after this closing parentheses, but before the closing curly brackets, we can just say dot and then call map. If you've never heard of map before, that's okay. We definitely have not covered arrays or map in this bootcamp series, but again, this is all covered in the 10 days of JavaScript. Anyways, we just give map a function, and it will run that function once for each item in this array or collection. So let's provide an anonymous function here in map. So function, parentheses, curly brackets. Now each time map calls our function, it's going to pass into it the current item that's been looped to. So in these parentheses, we would receive that with a parameter. We could call it anything, but let's call it breed. Okay, then inside the body of this function, let's return another template literal. So return backticks, let's say the HTML option element. Right, we want one of these for each item in this collection. Inside the opening and closing tags, we'd want to do something dynamic. So $, curly brackets. Inside there, we just say breed. Okay, now map is going to return a brand new array where each item in the array contains this, but that array, when converted to text, because we're in a template literal, is going to be separated by awkward commas. We don't want that. We just want one seamless string of text without any weird commas. So right after this closing parentheses here, where map is returning the new array, we can just say dot join. Join converts an array into one single string of text, and then we can just give it a value of nothing. Well, not nothing, but just an empty string with not even a space, so there won't be any sort of separation in between the items. Okay, let's go ahead and save this, and I'm fully aware that I didn't explain map and join. In order to really understand how this is working, you will want to go watch the 10 days of JavaScript. But for now, let's not get too sidetracked on this. Let's go ahead and save, and if we refresh, you can see after refreshing, it takes a few hundred milliseconds or however slow or fast your internet connection is, but it went out onto the web. Not only did it fetch that data, but then our JavaScript dynamically created all of these options. Cool. So where do we go next from here? Well, now when a user clicks on this and actually selects one, so let's say they click on Beagle, well, we want our JavaScript to respond to this event of this select changing its value. And then we'd want to take whatever value they chose, and we'd want to use that, and then to think back to the dog API server, we'd want to use the endpoint of by breed, right? Instead of the endpoint that selects all dog breeds, now we want to work or fetch data from this type of URL. So you'd hollow out, instead of hound here, it would be beagle or whatever the user selected, but we just fetch the data from this, and that would give us an array of all the images for that dog type. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's take this one step at a time. So first, we just want to respond to that event of this input changing its value. So in our JavaScript, when we're creating this select HTML, on the opening select tag, let's give it an attribute. So right here, we can just say on change, all lowercase, on change equals quotes. And our text editor doesn't know that we're in HTML right now. It still thinks we're in JavaScript. So when you say one quote, it doesn't know to automatically add the second ending quote. So just be aware of that. We want opening and closing quotes. And now let's just have it run a separate function. Remember, I like the idea of each function being bite-sized or sort of having a single responsibility. So our start function fetches the breed list. This function is just responsible for creating the select element. And then why don't we have a separate function? So maybe down here, let's create a brand new function and let's name it maybe load by breed, parentheses, curly brackets. And then that's what we want to call in this onChange equals quotes. Just say load by breed, parentheses to call it. Okay, and then in these parentheses, we would want to pass into this function whatever value the user has currently selected, right? So Beagle, or it could be any of these other ones. So in these parentheses, you can say this. Now the keyword of this is a huge topic in JavaScript. We're not going to get into it here. We do cover it a little bit in the 10 days of JavaScript. But for now, just know that this is sort of pointing towards the element in question, or the element that triggered or that is calling this function. So the select element itself. And then we can just look inside it. So this dot value. Now to test this out and to make sure you typed in everything correctly, in our new load by breed function, we'd want to receive that argument with a parameter. So again, you could say X or anything, but let's say breed. And then in the body of this function, just for a test, let's have an annoying alert pop up that shows what breed you selected. So just alert in the parentheses, breed. If we save that and then refresh in the browser, so go ahead and select, I'll choose Beagle again. And there is that annoying pop up with Beagle. And now anytime we change that, we're going to see the new breed. So there's Bulldog. Really quick though, let's set up a bit of conditional logic so that if you change it back to choose a dog breed, we don't actually acknowledge that. Because obviously on the dog server API, there is no dog breed called choose a dog breed. So here's what I would do. Inside our load by breed function, we can get rid of that alert, say if parentheses, curly brackets. For the condition in these parentheses, just say if breed does not equal, so that's exclamation equal to check for the opposite of equality. If it does not equal, quotes, choose a dog breed. And you will need to type this in exactly the way you typed it in up here. So capital choose. So now code in here will only run if it's something other than this. So here we could again say alert breed, give that a save, refresh. So now if I choose boxer, cool, that fired our event. But if I change this back to choose a dog breed, perfect, nothing happens. Cool, so from this point, we now can access the value that the user chose. We don't actually want to alert it though, so let's get rid of that. What we would actually want to do is use fetch once again to send a request to the dog server for that one particular breed. So if we're going to use fetch, that's going to return a promise. And if we want to be able to use the await syntax with our promises, we need this to be an asynchronous function. So right at the start of this line, we can just say async. Okay, now inside our if statement, we can just say const response equals await. And then we just use fetch once again. So fetch inside these parentheses. Let's go find that dog server URL pattern. So from the dog API website under documentation, we're interested in this by breed. Okay, and then you can just copy and paste this URL pattern here. We can paste that in here. Now we don't actually want this to be hard-coded to hound though. We want this to be whatever breed our user just selected. So actually, inside our fetch, instead of quotes, let's use backticks so we can do something dynamic. So now paste in your clipboard inside the backticks. Let's hollow out or delete hound. We want that part to be dynamic, right? So then $ curly brackets and say breed. Cool. On a new line of code, let's say const data equals await response.json parentheses to actually call that. Okay, and then just as a quick test, let's log the data to the console just so we can see visually sort of what the server is giving back to us. So console.log data. Let's give that a save and test it out. So back in our page, if I refresh, if I choose boxer and check my browser's console, you can see it gives me an array with 153 items. So that means there's 153 photos of boxer dogs. And there you see them. It looks like Google Chrome organizes them in groups of 100, but you can take any of these. So take this first one, for example, this path or URL, copy that in a new tab. Cool, you get the idea, right? That's a URL for a boxer dog. So now at this point, we go back to my console, we have the exact data we need. At this point, the rest of this tutorial has nothing to do with fetching data from an API, and it's just going to be sort of the user experience of building out the actual slideshow to show those images visually, and then every 2 or 3 seconds, or however many seconds you want, switch to the next photo, and then in another 3 seconds, show the next one. Now actually, before we write the JavaScript to make the photo switching happen, let's first look at the finished product example. And let's actually write a little bit of CSS to create this layout where this section takes up just the amount of space it needs, and then the entirety of the remaining screen space can be the slideshow area. Right? It doesn't matter how short or tall your browser window is, the CSS makes it so this slideshow area will expand to fill your entire screen. So let's set up this basic CSS skeleton. So back on our page, which looks quite boring at the moment, in our HTML, let's add CSS. So in the head section, maybe right after title, we can just say link and then hit tab. For the href value, let's point towards a file named main.css. Let's save this. Now let's go create a file with that matching name. So new file, name it main.css. Okay, let's begin by selecting the body element, which is the overall element, and get rid of any margin. And let's also say font family sans serif. Let's go refresh that. Now let's adjust the HTML to have maybe a couple of divs to handle this structure of sort of the header area and the slideshow area. So back in our HTML, let's actually get rid of all the content so far except for just the script tag. I think it's easier if we just start fresh. And I'm going to have an overall div with a class of app. So div.app, hit tab. Inside that, I'll have one div with a class of header. And then below the header div, I'll have one div with a class of slideshow. Okay, inside the header div, let's have our h1 that says infinite dog app. Then right below that, in that same div, let's have our div with an ID. So div hashtag breed, hit tab. Okay, and that's really all we need for the HTML. So now if we save that, nothing changes visually, but now let's add a bit of CSS to create the separation between header and slideshow. So in the CSS, I will target the overall app div, so .app. I'll tell it to have a height of 100%, and I'm going to spell out a width of 100%. Now, any block level element will use the full available width without us spelling it out like this, but because I'm going to use absolute positioning for the slides, I do just want to spell it out here. Anyways, on this same div, let's also say display flex, and by default, Flexbox is sharing the space horizontally, right? So multiple items can fit on the same row. Instead, I want to switch the flex direction to be column. So if we save that and refresh, it doesn't seem like anything changed because that's how divs are aligned by default, right? One sits on top of the other vertically. However, because that parent div of app uses Flexbox, now we can tell the slideshow div to take up all of the remaining vertical space. So to do that, we can just target our slideshow div and tell it to have a flex value of 1. Now visually, it's hard to tell that it's taking up the full space because it's empty, right? The slideshow div is empty. However, if we give it a background color now that it's using flex1, so background color, hashtag 333. Now if we try, cool, you can see that it's using the full available remaining height. Okay, really quick, let's just center this content horizontally. So in our CSS, we can target our header and just say text align center. Maybe I'll target the h1 inside the header. And just say for margin, it shouldn't have any on the top right, it should have a little bit on the bottom, and doesn't need any on the left. Let's test that out. Okay, maybe give the overall header element a bit of vertical padding. So header, let's say padding 20px and 0. Okay. Let's tell the select to maybe use a slightly larger font size, or at least the standard font size. This looks a little bit small. So I would just say header space select font size 1 rem. Cool. Okay, now in terms of how we actually display the images here, there's many different ways we could set this up. If you asked 100 different developers to code a slideshow, you would get 100 different solutions. This is just the way that I'm going to do it. Because there's nothing else on the page, and we really don't need the slideshow to sort of fit into the content on the page, I just want the slide to take up this full available space. And I want the image to scale to fit inside this, not just horizontally, but also vertically. So while we could add image elements in the HTML, right, the img tag, I'm actually instead going to use CSS background images to display the image. Let me show you what I have in mind. So back in our CSS, I'm going to tell the slideshow to use position relative. So that way I can position its children in relation to it using absolute positioning. Let me show you an example of what I have in mind. For now, let's actually just hard code this with HTML, and then once it's up and running, we can switch to JavaScript. But inside the slideshow div, let's add a new div and give it a class of just slide. Let's give that a save. Now back in our CSS, let's target slide, curly brackets, and let's say position absolute. And now I want it to take up the full available space. So not just the width, but even the full available height. So I would say top 0, bottom 0, left 0, right 0. Okay, so now each slide is going to take up the full space. To test this out, you could say background color red. Save, refresh, you get the idea. So each slide, each dog photo is going to be a slide div, and it will take up the full screen. Let's get rid of this background color line. Instead, we're going to use a background image. So we can actually save this and jump into your HTML because we want to be able to control the image from our HTML or JavaScript. So on this div with a class of slide, right after the quotes, we can give it another attribute of style equals quotes. And here you can include a bit of inline CSS. So we're just going to say background dash image colon URL parentheses pair of quotes. And now let's just temporarily hard code a URL to a dog image. So I still have in my clipboard the URL to that one box or dog photo. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and refresh. So there it is, only we don't want it to tile and repeat. Right? This looks very 1997. So instead, we want to tell it to size the background image to fit within this entire area. And we don't know if the image is going to be wider than it is tall or taller than it is wide. We have no idea what sort of images the API is going to give us. So what I'm going to do, back in the CSS, on that slide, I'll just say background repeat, no repeat. So that'll stop the tiling. And then I'm going to say background size contain. Just to make sure, let's say background position, center both horizontally and vertically. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. Cool. So the contain value is the star of the show here. It's going to automatically size the image to be as large as possible while still fitting in our container. I think this will work nicely, but if you don't want to use contain, you could also try a value of cover, and that will fill up all of the available space, but there's no guarantee that it's going to crop the image in a way that makes sense. And because there's so many different image aspect ratios in this API, I'm just going to stick with contain. For the most part, this doesn't matter. This is supposed to be a JavaScript tutorial, not a CSS tutorial. Okay, at this point, now that we have the basic layout set up, let's get back to JavaScript and let's have it use the array of images, and after every 3 seconds, we want it to switch to the next image. Now, again, I really believe if you asked 100 different developers, you'd get 100 different solutions on how to implement this. This is just what I would do. So let's jump back into our JavaScript. Down at the bottom, within our load by breed function, we don't actually want to just log the data to the console. Instead, what we want to do is use JavaScript to add HTML into that empty slideshow div. So for example, back in index.html, I want you to select this entire div with a class of slide and just cut it into your clipboard because we're going to want it in our JavaScript. Okay, but we want our HTML to just have an empty div with a class of slideshow. Let's save that. Now back in our JavaScript, remember we like to keep each function having just one responsibility. So the job of this function is just to load the images for a breed. So let's just pass this data off to a separate function. So maybe at the very bottom in a totally separate function, let's say function create slideshow, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and then in this function, after the console.log, let's just pass it into that function. So create slideshow. And let's actually not just give it data, but give it data.message. The reason for this is if you refresh your page and click on a dog type and check the console, the JavaScript that the dog server sends back to us, all of the interesting array of images live inside a property named message. Now, we didn't make up this name or property of message. This is just a name that the dog server chose to use. But that is what contains the actual array of images. So that's what we want to pass into our function. Okay, we can get rid of this console.log up in this function. In our new function, let's receive that incoming argument with a parameter. So we'll say images. You could call it anything. And then just for a test, inside the function, we can say console.log images. Give that a save. Refresh. I'll choose Corgi. Check the console. Awesome. So instead of an object with different properties like message and success or failure, we literally just get an array with a bunch of images. Okay, now at this point, again, this function's only job is just to load the data. Now it's up to this function to actually create the HTML for that empty slideshow div. So inside this function, we don't actually need to log the data to the console. What we really want to do is select that empty div. So document, and actually let's go give that div an ID in our HTML, just so we have an easy way to hook onto it. So in the HTML, this empty div with a class of slideshow, why don't we just also give it an ID of slideshow? Okay, be sure to save that. Back in our JavaScript, we just say document.get element by ID. We're looking for the ID of slideshow. This will return an object that represents that element, and then we just say .inner HTML equals, let's use backticks so we can drop down to a new line, and here let's just paste in our clipboard. Right, so this was that HTML with the div that has a class of slide, and then we're setting the background image. Now let's actually go ahead and make this dynamic. So we don't want to hard code it to a specific image. So I want you to select and delete from the beginning of HTTPS until the .jpeg. And in these quotes, to do something dynamic in a template literal, we just say $ curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, we would just say images. That's the array of images from the server. And then in JavaScript, after an array, you can just say square brackets. So that's the character to the right of the P key. And to access the first item in the array, instead of a 1, it's actually a 0. Arrays are 0 based. Okay, so this should give us the first image for whatever dog breed we choose. Let's test it out. So if I save that and refresh, let's go ahead and choose Beagle. Awesome. I like the vibe of this photo. Let's change it to Corgi. Cool. So that works. Now we just need to set up a timer that happens maybe every 3 seconds that switches to the second photo being displayed. And then after that, display the third photo, so on and so forth. Now to achieve this, we could just change the background image URL. So every 3 seconds, we could change this from 0 to 1, and then to 2 to 3. You get the idea, right? Just change this every 3 seconds. However, I don't just want to switch the image immediately. Instead, I want an animation or a gradual fade between the two photos. right? If we look at the example of the finished product and I choose Beagle, notice when the image switches to the next image, the old one sort of fades or zooms out and the new one sort of fades or zooms or animates in. So to achieve this effect, we're going to need to have more than one of those slide divs at once. Because if you think about it, we want the old photo to still exist on the page for that split second while they're both sort of either fading out or fading in or transitioning between the two. So let me show you what I'm going to do. Let me put this array index back to 0, right, to load the very first image. And instead of just having this single div with a class of slide, I'm actually just going to duplicate it so that there's two of them. Okay, the first one can show the first image, the second one, instead of 0, 1, right, to show the second image. So when you first load a breed of dog, 2 images are going to be added to the page. And then 3 seconds in the future, we can add the third image right here. So then there would be 3 total slide divs, and we can just use CSS to write a selector that says the second to last slide div should be the one that's visible. So then every 3 seconds, we add the new photo to the end of our collection, and we just remove the oldest photo, right? And CSS will sort of handle animating or fading or zooming or transitioning between which one should actually be shown. Let me show you what I mean in the CSS. So right below this rule for slide, let's have a new rule and say .slide colon nth dash last dash child parentheses with a value of 2. So that will select the second to last item of this type. And let's say opacity 1 to be fully visible. Let's set the baseline style to be opacity 0 so that it's invisible. And then to create that nice zoom effect down here, be sure to add a semicolon. Let's say transform scale maybe 1.08. And then on the baseline style, we can say transform scale just 1, the regular size. Okay, then on this baseline style, we just tell it to transition gradually. So we can say transition all properties over the course of 0.9 seconds and use the ease out timing function. Let's go ahead and save this. So now in JavaScript, as we add new images onto the end and we remove the oldest or first image, this CSS selector will take care of always making sure that the second to last image is the one that's actually visible. So now back in our JavaScript, let's first create a variable that keeps track of which number we should be on, right? And then we can increment it once every 3 seconds to control the next image that should be shown. So maybe towards the top of our create slideshow function, maybe right above this document line, I'll say let current position. I just made up this variable name, but let that equal 0. Okay, and then after we display the initial 2 slides, so right after this template literal, so right after this closing backtick, right below that, I can just say current position, and we just want to add on 2 to it. So plus equal 2, right? Because we've already used the 0 image and the 1 image. So we'd want to advance our counter 2 images that have already been displayed. And now this is where we would want to set up a timer. So beyond this, now every 3 seconds from now, we would want to advance this 1 more. Let me show you what I mean. So right here we can say set interval. This is a function that exists in JavaScript, and you give it 2 arguments. So the first is a function that you want to run. We haven't created this function yet, but we can create it in just a moment. Why don't we call it next slide? Okay, comma. The second argument is how many milliseconds you want to wait before running this. So let's say 3,000 milliseconds. So it waits this long before running it the first time, and then subsequently it's going to run it every 3,000 milliseconds after. Okay, now we better go create a function with this exact matching name. So right below this, we can just say function next slide, parentheses, curly brackets. And notice where I created this new function. So we're still inside our overall create slideshow function. So yes, you can have a function inside a function. We're doing this so that within next slide, we have access to the current position variable. This has to do with the topic of variable scope, which we're not going to get into here, but we do cover it in the 10 days of JavaScript. So in this function, the first thing I want to do is just add on another slide div at the end of this HTML. So I would just grab one of these slide divs into my clipboard, then back in next slide, let's start working with this slideshow div. So document.get element by ID, quotes slideshow. And we don't want to set its entire inner HTML. Instead, we just want to modify what's already there. We want to add on to the end of it. So we can say dot insert adjacent HTML. And we give this two arguments. The first we'll say before end. So before the end of this element is where we want to insert this new HTML, comma, the second argument is just the HTML that you want to add. So I'll say two backticks, paste in my clipboard. Okay, and now in terms of which image from the array we want to show, let's get rid of a number here. Instead, we would just want this to be current position. Okay, now we would also want to remove the oldest photo from this HTML after it's had a chance to sort of animate or transition out of view. Now remember, in our CSS, we said that the transition should take 0.9 seconds to fully animate. So why don't we just wait 1 second before removing the oldest photo from the HTML? So within our next slide function, right below this first line that we just wrote, here's what I would do. We can use a function in JavaScript called setTimeout. This is really similar to setInterval. You give it two things, a function and how long you want to wait. Only timeout isn't going to keep running it again and again. It's just going to run it once after a delay. So if we give it two arguments, a comma b, the b would be 1000 milliseconds. We want to wait. After we wait that long, we just want to select and delete the oldest slide div. So you could create a different named function and point towards it, or we could just use an anonymous function here. So function, parentheses, curly brackets. Inside this function, we just want to remove the first element that has a class of slide. So I just say document.querySelector, and then you can give this a CSS-like selector. So just .slide, and this will not select all of them. It just selects the very first instance of this. So it'll find the first slide, and then we can just say .remove. Okay, now below this set timeout block of code, so right after the 1000 closing parentheses, let's also say that after this runs, we want to increase current position by 1. So that when this runs again in 3000 milliseconds, well, this would now point towards the 4th image, and then the 5th and 6th and 7th image. Right? We need to advance the current position. But what happens when we get to the end of the collection of images? So what if there's a breed of dogs and it only has maybe 5 images? Well, once we've shown the 5th and final image, we would want to circle back to the 0 or the first image. So I would just use an if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets. Right after those, I would also say else, curly brackets. For the condition, I would just say if current position plus 1 is greater than or equal to images.length. So this is our array of images. Every array in JavaScript has a property of length that is a count of how many items it contains. So if the current position plus 1 is greater than or equal to that, we want to set the current position back down to 0. So we can start over in the slideshow. So current position should equal 0. Else, otherwise, we would just want to increment it by 1. So current position. Now you could say equals current position plus 1, or you can just say plus plus right after it to increment it. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So if I refresh, let me choose Corgi. Okay, so it's working, but notice there's the weird horizontal scroll bar and the image is a little bit taller than the container. This is because I added the zoom effect. You can see it sort of looks like the photos are zooming in and out. We would just want to tell the container to have overflow hidden to fix that. So back in our CSS, let's find our overall slideshow div. I would just say overflow hidden. Test that out again. I'll choose boxer. Cool. Now, one detail I want to take care of is if you're already viewing the slideshow for one breed, but then you switch to a different breed, well, I would want to delete or cancel the timer that's going to run every 3 seconds for the old slideshow. So let me show you how we can do that. Back in our JavaScript, up at the very top, sort of in the global scope of our entire file, let's create a variable and call it timer. And why don't we also create one and call it delete first photo delay. They don't even need to equal anything. We're just establishing variables with these names in the global scope. Okay, then down in our create slideshow function, right here when we're setting current position to equal 0, this is where when we're loading a new slideshow, right, this is going to run anytime you choose a new dog breed. This is where we can just cancel the existing timeouts and the existing interval. So we can just say clear interval, and then you just give it the name. So timer, and then clear timeout, give it the name was delete first photo delay. Okay, and then down below when we're actually setting the interval and the timeout, we would just want to set them to equal that variable. So when we say set interval at the start of this line, you just say timer equals set interval, right? So now it's going to be working with this thing that we can clear, this variable that we have access to later. And then let's also find the set timeout. So right here, at the start of this set timeout line, we would say delete first photo delay equals set timeout. Let's give that a save. So now if I refresh and if I load Corgi, and then if on the fly I switch to boxer, cool, everything continues to work as expected. Before we're done though, we do need to take care of a few edge cases. So what if a collection of dogs only has one image or only 2 images? We would want to adjust our logic a bit. So for example, the dog breed of Finnish in this API only has 1 photo. So in that case, here's what I would do. So this line where we initially add the first 2 images, let's add a bit of space right above that. From that line down to where we set the timer, I'm actually going to cut that into my clipboard and set up an if-else block. So if parentheses, curly brackets, else, curly brackets. For the condition, I'll say only if images.length is greater than 1. So if that's the case, then in the if block, you can just paste your clipboard back in. But otherwise, else, if there's only 1 image, well, I just copy this line of code. So from document down to the ending backtick. In the else block, paste that in. We don't actually want to display the second photo, so just get rid of style. We do want to keep just an empty div though, so that our CSS continues to make sense, because our CSS says that the second to last div of slide should be shown. So if we just have an empty div here, this will still work. Okay? The idea is in this else block, we're not calling set next slide every 3000 milliseconds. If there's only 1 image in the entire collection, just do this and then don't do anything else. Okay, and then finally, what if a collection of images has only exactly 2 images? Right, so if you think of the array that contains only 2 items in it, there'd be the 0 or first item, 1 would be the second item, and that's all that's in the entire array. So we wouldn't want to set current position to 2. Instead, we would just want to set current position back down to 0 so that it can loop through the images, just the 2 images, endlessly. So to do that, maybe right after this line where we say current position plus equals 2, I would just say if parentheses for the condition, if images.length double equal sign to check for equality instead of assigning equality. So we're checking for equality. If it equals 2, then you don't need curly brackets after the if condition if it fits on a single line right after it. So we can just say if that, then current position, set it back down to 0. Okay, let's go ahead and save this. Now we can test out these edge cases. If we refresh, I know that the Finnish dog breed only has 1 photo exactly. So if I pick Finnish, hopefully it just sits there and doesn't try to advance to the next photo. It's looking good. Also, I know that the Dalmatian breed has only exactly 2 photos. So if I choose Dalmatian, there's the first photo. There's the second. Hopefully it loops back to the first. Perfect. At this point, our basic slideshow is complete. Before we bring this video to a close though, I do want to show you one detail, and that is how to deal with failure if your fetch commands don't work. I should have shown this to you way back when we were actually working with the fetch requests, but it's better late than never. So back in our JavaScript, let's take our start function up at the very top, for example. So imagine that someone's network connection goes down, or for some reason the dog server API goes down. We wouldn't want our JavaScript to run into a huge error and everything to just break. Instead, we would want things to sort of fail gracefully. So here's what I would do. Everything in this function, right, these 3 lines of code in the body of the function, let's just copy those into our clipboard. And instead, we can set up a try block. So try, curly brackets, right after that, catch, curly brackets. And actually, to make older versions of Microsoft Edge happy, right after catch, we do want to say parentheses E. I'll explain what this is in just a moment. In newer browsers, this is optional, but in older browsers, you do want to include this. Anyways, in the try block, you can include whatever you want to try, and then if it fails, if it runs into any sort of problem or error, then the catch block will run. And the catch block only runs if there's a problem. So in the try block, we could just paste our code back in. In the catch block, we can say console.log, there was a problem fetching the breed list. Now to circle back to this E or error parameter, this contains information on the exact error that happened. In certain situations, that's going to be super useful. In this situation, I don't think the visitor of our website really cares what the technical reason was. So we're not actually using it. We're just going to display our own custom message. Now, if we save this and test it out, we won't see anything in the console because we're not running into an error. However, if your internet went down or the dog server went down or there was any sort of problem in our code, so for example, right above this line, if we just say just gibberish, so there is no variable to reference with this name. So if we hit save, that's going to create a problem. JavaScript knows if there's a problem in the try block, the catch block should then be executed. So there was a problem fetching the breed list. So you don't need to do this in every situation, right? Because if you're just saying 2 + 2, that has 0 chance of failing. So you don't need to wrap that in a try catch block. This is really just for situations that could likely fail. Okay. Cool, let's test it out one more time. Boxer, looking good. That is going to bring the technical aspect of this video to a close. Whew, that was a long video. Now, I don't think it's realistic for me to expect that you just absorbed 100% of that material. However, hopefully this video inspired you or gave you a few ideas of other apps that you can create. So for example, at the very start of this video, remember that GitHub page called Public APIs? Maybe now you want to go back and revisit that page, find a different API to work with instead of just the dog API, and build your own little sample application that pulls in the data. The possibilities are infinite, and I think it'll be a great exercise for you to maybe try to put something together on your own. Anyways, looking ahead to the next video, we're going to build a simple math game. So it'll ask you simple math problems, and then if you put in the right answer, if you get 10 points, you win. If you get 3 wrong answers, you lose. So that's what's coming up next, and if you've been enjoying this series so far, as always, I'd appreciate it if you share the link with your friends and family. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.